Welcome back to another episode of Bourbon Bytes. I'm your host, Terry McGraw, Cape Endeavors Incorporated. On this edition, we actually have the entire Cape Endeavors crew, and we're going to provide some insights into bourbon as well as insights into the CMMC process, as we have some recent experience bringing several companies successfully through CMMC certification. And I thought it's particularly the guests I have with me this evening are about as high expertise as we can get in this area. And I thought their insights would be very beneficial to all of us. So I have with me Dewayne Alford, the Chief Operating Officer for Cape Endeavors Incorporated. And I have Andy Paul, the Chief Technology Officer and Lead Assessor for Cape Endeavors Incorporated. So we are here at Bourbon Bytes. We're going to celebrate with some bourbon. As I mentioned earlier, we have successfully collectively brought through now 23 companies through CMMC assessment with a perfect 110. So our track record remains unblemished. But before we start all of the shop talk, I did want to talk a little bit because we are Bourbon Bytes, and tonight we are sipping on some Blantons. But I thought it'd be interesting because we do have two bourbon experts with us this evening, in Dewayne and Andy. I pale in comparison, but I did want to talk to you guys a little bit about sort of what's your favorite thing to imbibe upon, and if it's bourbon, what's your favorite bourbon?
Go ahead.
Blanton's is a good one, right? It's kind of that kind of run of the mill, that upper echelon. You can't really find it, but it's nice when you have it type of one. My favorite from the same distillery, the Colonel H. Taylor. I think that's my favorite one out of that Buffalo Trace run of products. How about you?
I'm simple, dude. I like Maker's Mark, Maker's 46.
There you go.
See, I prefer my bourbon a little on the sweeter side, so I'm a big Angel's Envy, like the Special Reserve kind of thing. I like the vanilla high notes on the back end, so I like my bourbon just a little sweeter than the straight, the whiskey profile. I tend to shy away from. I like more of the sweeter version. So, but that's on the alcohol front.
Angel Envy is good.
It really is good. Yeah. So that's my favorite. We don't yet have a sponsor, by the way. Blant's is not a sponsor of ours, but we do all enjoy bourbon. And as we are here, we're celebrating with our bourbon and a small toast to 23 companies that we have successfully brought through CMMC certification with efficiency and effectiveness, and for the lowest price point you'll probably find out there. So moving into the CMMC arena. So when a company is seeking certification, there's generally three approaches that we've talked about. So Andy, can you explain sort of what the three most practical approaches are to solving this problem if you're an organization seeking certification?
Yeah, the way I love getting that question when I'm dealing with a customer is I don't need you to do a gap analysis with me. I know I'm not doing anything. Let's just pretend like I'm not doing anything. How do I start from there? And really there's three options. There's three paths to being CMMC compliant. One is you lift your whole entire organization. You put those 110 controls, 320 objectives, put them in place everywhere. You go through the assessment with everything inside your environment. The second is the opposite approach. You say, I want to not do that in my environment. I want to go over here to the side. I want to build a box that meets all these requirements. Call that an enclave. And I'm going to go take the CUI out of my environment, go drop it inside of that enclave, and then that thing is just secured, and it's there strictly to meet the government's.
It's not just storage; it's processing, storage, it's everything. It is an entire network. But yep.
You bring the user to the data, right? So I can help do things like have somebody overseas that needs to look at IDAR. I'm not sending the data to them. I'm bringing the user to the data, putting them inside of that box that is secured and meets all 110 controls. Then the third option is, I build that enclave, and then I just migrate my whole entire company into that enclave. I migrate over to that more of a secure process. The difference between that migrate over versus trying to lift my whole organization is, if I currently have to make a whole bunch of changes inside of my environment, it can feel like death by 1,000 cuts, right? You're just constantly have to change a tool, have to do some sort of implementation. This is a bad flow for your average user experience. That migrate in is more of a rip the Band-Aid off approach. But most companies, the average, I'm not talking about a specific person, can work in this kind of bifurcated. I've got my normal environment. Everybody keeps doing business the way they were. When they have to deal with the government's data, they swivel seat. It's the old red computer that was on the secret network, right? Now spin over and work on that one, right? It's the same approach. We're just doing it now with a little window, a virtual desktop on my computer that I can remote into to do that work.
Yeah.
And as far as which of those three options make the most sense to you, it's a pretty easy question, right? If everybody in your company works with CUI all day, every day, you need to lift your whole company, right? That's all they're doing. You need options 1 or 3. And it just depends on how hard it is to get to option 1. Option 3 makes the most sense. A good example of that is a company that has the accounting contract for, say, like a whole entire military branch. That's all they do is military accounting. Everybody's doing CUI processing all day, every day. That's a good lift the entire company up approach. The next one is if just some people deal with CUI. They can deal with CUI all day, every day, but it's just a limited number of users. Or if even the majority of users do it, they just do it a little bit. Maybe I only need to once a quarter actually go in and help with a bid or look at something. It's very rare that I actually see CUI. That's when the enclave approach happens. And as you interview actual people that need to do CUI and actually try to find it, put your finger on it as it goes through, you'll see that most of the time they're not doing CUI processing with their day-to-day jobs. They're doing other stuff and just occasionally touching CUI. And that's when that enclave model really starts to shine. Less impact to the user, greater adoption for being able to be secure, and then dramatically reduce implementation times, ready to be assessed times, and assessment risk.
And overall costs. I mean, I think that one thing that we fail to underestimate when we're talking to companies who want to get CMMC compliant, but if you're a company that's been around a while or has had merger and acquisitions or extends beyond the continental United States, you've got all kinds of constraints that you're not going to be able to solve to raise your whole environment. Mm-hmm. You're going to have people outside the U.S. You're going to have data outside the U.S. You're going to have legacy equipment that won't meet the intent. If you don't know if you've got CUI basic or CUI specified, what cloud or what environment do I need to harden to? There's a lot of pragmatic questions, practical questions that come into play that make it really infeasible for all but the smallest of companies to try to raise their whole environment. And in almost every case we've personally seen, and we've had customers that run the gamut from very small to G100, where even in the small enclaves is the fastest, most effective approach to getting there. That's not to say that those other two options are viable and legitimate. They are, but the use cases for them actually in practicality are very small. And almost always trying to build a secure environment that meets the DoD requirements and gives you peace of mind can be done. Last thing, I think we failed to talk about this earlier. There is a clause in the DFARS and FAR that says that compliance activities to this framework are an allowable cost that you can charge back to the government. True, Andy?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you go to the DoD procurement toolbox and you look it up, I think it's question 157. I've shown this so many times, right? When you go in there, if you just search for that, you'll see in there there's an explicit question that's been asked and explicit answers showing that, yes, this is an allowable cost and this is something that you can, and how you go about doing it. You go back to your original argument that you were saying earlier about, given I'm renewing a contract that I've had since 2015, I've been reattesting it. Okay, this could be kind of an awkward thing for you to try to pull off.
Yeah.
But yes, it is something that the DoD anticipated helping. You hear Katie Arrington harp on this all the time. She anticipated the DoD paying more money for you to become secure, not for you just to tell her you were secure and locked right? So the capacity does exist. How you go about doing that varies based on type of contracts and how you go about doing your job. But this is not a cost you have to bear yourself. It doesn't just have to be just a hit to your bottom line. It is something that you can actually see a return on investment more than just the loss of or more return on investment than say just the loss of security risk, but the more contracts that I'm getting about becoming compliant, as well as an actual just higher contract award to you because of what you're being compliant.
I do think it's important to note that there's a line of integrity and ethics that go into this as well, right? So if you're planning on using a chargeback to the government to do basic blocking and tackling that you legitimately should have always been doing, you can have a really hard time justifying that that's not malfeasance, right? I mean, but if in fact you're new to the DIB, this is a new contract. This is a cost that you hadn't anticipated. It absolutely is an allowable cost. How you use that, how you charge that, how that looks in a competitive environment, that's up to individuals to determine on their own. But it is a mechanism, and Stacy Bostianek and Katie Arrington have both spoken about it publicly. As Andy's already attested that it's available and you can go read it. Have your legal team look at it. We're not lawyers; we can't offer legal advice, but it is in there to offset some of those costs. So it is a mechanism for you to pursue. When we talk to customers first coming to us and they're just sort of struggling with getting their arms around the CMMC program and certification in general, what trips them up most? Like a company with no experience in this, they know they have to be compliant, they have DoD contracts. Is there a recurring theme? Like what comes up the most when you're talking to potential prospects or customers that they really need help in this area?
What I've been noticing the most is it's kind of default answer to say they skip scoping, but what does that actually mean? They're making decisions on inaccurate data. So you'll hear the statement like, my CUI is everywhere. I've got all these it's a complicated environment. I've got complicated tools. It's just never true. Well, typically it's not true. Typically your CUI is not everywhere. It's not as prolific. You don't have as much of it out there. You don't have as many people using it. It's generally a smaller subset. And so once you actually know what CUI you have, you've actually scoped your environment, got down to, okay, I'm just talking about these particular applications, these particular types of files, and these users. Then when you go into all of how do I do proper encryption on this sort of thing, you can actually answer that because it's not this ephemeral, magical unicorn beast you can't put your hands around. I'm trying to talk about everything in my environment. No, I'm talking about these specific systems. And the way you get there is scoping. Everybody skips scoping the first time they go through it. Then they're frustrated because they can't figure out, it's too big. It's not there's not like a set amount of stuff that I got to go solve. It's an unknown that I'm trying to solve. So it always feels too big to tackle until you step back and you find out what is it I'm actually trying to do here. Yeah,
I think that along with that, personally, folks they struggle to understand what my CUI is. Is it specified or is it basic? Right? Because that also affects the approach that you're going to have to take to become compliant. I've seen that folks, they understand that this is a CUI data flow problem. And by that meaning, where is CUI stored, processed, or transmitted, right? Processing of that CUI is important. And what I found, and Dewayne, you can speak to this, when folks are coming to us and they've bought into a solution, or B, they bought into an infrastructure that says they're CMMC compliant, but they find that they're like 50 or 80% the way there. They're not all the way there because they didn't understand that. Do you have any additional insights on sort of the lack of understanding what that CUI handling means?
Yeah. So I think it's kind of a lot of what Andy was talking about too, is like, they just don't know, right? They don't know where it's at. They don't know what it is, what type it is. And even some of our clients are coming into this kind of like pre-CUI, right? They're looking at it from a point of view of, I want to go after these contracts, but I want to be secure first, but I think I need to secure everything. That's not necessarily the case, right? You got to determine, what is your business processes? Mm-hmm. What is your business processes going to look like when you're actually got a contract with a customer, and how do you want to handle that? Then you build around that. That's the easiest way to do it. Yeah,
we find when we do scoping calls, just to help them understand this, again, like, I think I have to secure my whole environment. And what we found, we have some very large customers who are global, and CMMC compliance to them is actually infeasible, maybe even impossible, just because of the footprint that they have and the personnel and the distribution. But you're absolutely right. They don't have to solve it for everywhere. They have to handle it for what stores, processes, or transmits that CUI, and who processes or stores or transmits that CUI. And only those folks that actually interact with it are part of that data flow. And so you not necessarily have to tackle everything, unless, of course, you've been doing it wrong, which brings us to the second point is, a big piece of the scoping that's missed is, where is my CUI? Like, so if assuming that you already have a DoD contract, and you haven't been through CMMC, there's a large probability that you have not been handling it correctly, which means it is places it's not supposed to be according to an 800 and 171 framework. And so how would you all sort of advise customers to sort of approach that problem? I mean, we ended up building or participating in building a product to kind of go after that. But speak about the problem itself. Like, how do you find the CUI? What's that approach, and how do you know you've got it? Because we've had a lot of whistleblower, publicity or publication, people calling whistleblower like CUIs everywhere, to what you said, Andy. Is that true?
Yeah. What I've found is, so you'll talk to somebody that's trying to solve that piece. Now, they're the ones that'll give you the CUIs everywhere kind of default response. When you try to actually find the CUI, you really have two ways you can go about it. You can scan for it with a tool, with some sort of, trying to find these letters on a document in a certain particular spot, or you go and you interview every single person. You start at the top. You say, okay, what business units would it make sense for a CUI to be in? Okay, go to the managers there. What people may be on contracts? Find a person that, if CUI exists, that's a person that'll have it. And then you do your basic ISO input, process, output mapping. Where would you get CUI from? What would you do with it? Where does it go? And then you give the challenge. Can you show me a piece of CUI? Like, can you actually pull one up and give it to you? And honestly, a lot of times you'll be surprised at how rare they can actually do that. They'll be like, well, this over here's CUI, and then they'll open a document. It's not CUI. There's no markings on it. They were just thinking that everything associated with a contract is CUI, but it's only that stuff that's marked CUI that's been told to you to put that marking on there. So that process, that's kind of the historical way we would go to, we call it day in the life, mappings of the customer journey, the CUI flow. That's one way to find it. And when you go through that, you'll identify that, man, all these people are only using a couple of applications. And most people, it kind of funnels back to a couple of kind of work streams that are doing it. Even in really complex workflows, that's still kind of the case that you'll see. And that can start learning. I'm not talking about everything. I'm just talking about these couple of applications and this subset of users that could actually go and tell me where one is. So when you start actually interviewing the people on the ground, you get a different answer than that, holistic. I'm just talking about the size of the problem, or I'm wrapping my head around it, and it's everywhere. It's too big. When you start diving into those business flows, you don't see that. And then really the second approach is just try to control up your environment and look for it, which that doesn't necessarily work. And the problem with that approach is there's so many things that it can find. Like, CUI is not as well defined as like a social security number, right? If I see 4 numbers dash 4 numbers dash 4 numbers dash 4 numbers, I know that's probably a credit card number. Or 3 numbers dash 2 numbers dash 4 numbers, that's probably a social security number. CUI is not that well formed. Every agency can give their own marking guidance. You got cover pages, you got header footings, you got distribution text, you've got CUI specified, which will have different types of headers than basic, and every style that goes in there, every type of specified CUI has a different style marking on it. So that can become really cumbersome. So you try to create a regex I'll go look for it, you'll end up with a lot of false positives. So people will go and they'll say, hey, I'm going to do a purview scan of my environment and look for, CUI space, or like bracket CUI bracket, something like that. And they'll come back and they'll say, of the 21 million files, 150,000 of them are CUI. But then when you start looking into them, still none of these are. It's a circuit guide that has a CUI inside of stuff like that.
Or your grandma's biscuit recipe.
Yeah, that's right. The test files that we always use to go through it all have the same header: to recruiting biscuits, rescuing cuisine. Just pound those CUI letters and then watch it just trip every single scanner
because I think that most folks don't understand is that the typical, either the data loss prevention or e-discovery tools that are available in the market are using sort of very simple regular expressions, and they're looking for CUI throughout the document. The problem is, you just mentioned, CUI appears in a lot of different things. Also, a lot of them are limited to only like OCR documents, meaning documents you can actually extract text from. They don't handle CAD drawings, for example. They don't handle pictures of drawings. Like if someone had scanned a document, it's now a JPEG, but it's labeled as CUI, that because it's been replicated. That is still CUI, right? And so they have most of the scanners fail miserably when it comes to doing that. And so we can talk about sort of the Terminus product in a corollary here at the end. When you're interviewing customers, Dewayne, and you and I have been part of sort of the interview process to extract from them what they do. I have found that most of them, don't understand what makes CUI. So, for example, they see the DFARS clause in the contract and immediately just assumed everything associated with that is CUI. But that's not at all the case. And what are some experiences you get, like when you're trying to like extract from someone who's struggling to understand where is the CUI in the environment or what the scope of that is? Do you find that they just really don't even understand the requirements in order to? They say that they have CUI, but really don't. I mean,
yeah. So I think a lot of the confusion stems from a lot of the noise you hear in the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
That CUI is tied to a DoD contract, and you have the authority to mark the CUI because you have a DoD contract. That's not accurate, right? It's got to be part of the requirement that's flowed down from either the person you're getting the contract from or the DoD itself, and it's got to be marked properly at that point, right? So a lot of clients will come in with the concept of, well, I got this contract, I produced this thing for this contract, isn't that CUI? And it's not always that case, right? And then you do see that overmarking problem where a lot of people are saying everything associated with this thing is CUI, right? And that's just not the case. So you have to really, really get them to, I think Andy's point is produce one. Produce what you think you're doing here, or produce some language that you think is driving you to make these decisions. And a lot of times that really does help with their education.
So underscoping, meaning that you're not handling the CUI correctly, is a problem. But overscoping is also a problem. Like from a business perspective, it can be inordinately expensive to try to address this for what you think is CUI, but actually isn't. Do you share that sort of experience that folks are just like trying to solve for a much bigger problem than actually exists?
Yeah. I mean, you have cases where you're talking with clients and they have 100 employees and everybody touches CUI, right? Everybody saves CUI. Everybody has access to CUI. That may be the case because you haven't scoped properly, right? So when you start peeling the onion back and you get them to actually start talking about the input, process, output methodology of who's getting this, what is happening to it, and then what are they doing with it afterwards, it's a really small subset of most companies. And, that's when the light bulbs start coming on for clients.
Let's talk a little bit about the store, process, and transmit portion that sort of defines scope, if you will. Mm-hmm. We've seen products and competition out there saying that they sort of can solve your problem with a singular environment or a singular tool. But what it doesn't take into account is if I open CUI and I view that CUI, I am processing that CUI, correct? Mm-hmm. And so if I'm processing it, now the device that I'm processing or looking at it on is now in scope. And if that's a laptop in someone's house because they're a remote worker, congratulations, you just entered their home into the scope of the assessment. Is that true?
Yeah, with the exception of the explicitly called out, unless you're using a VDI. Again, the scoping guide, it all goes back to scope. In the out of scope asset, there's an explicit exclusion for a very particular type of architecture. That's this remote desktop where I've put in a whole bunch of very specific controls that stops you from the ability of grabbing a screen capture, a screen grabber malware on your computer, stealing it as you're processing it. Unless you're in that extremely specific, typically a cloud-based PC, a virtual desktop environment that you've remoted into on a very specific FedRAMP high connection, then yes, that laptop is in scope. You're using it to process CUI, and now if the way that you're connecting to that thing's in scope, the Wi-Fi point that endpoint's connecting to could be your Alex router. Now that's in scope, and that's where this kind of scope creep keeps going out. Another big problem, that same thing, is the use of VPNs, right? Every time you would do this, you're kind of extending that boundary, and when you go through CMMC, that is keep my boundary as small as possible. I do that by knowing my CUI flow so I can put the boundary just around that and not around something else that's not there because I let it in my boundary. Now it's another vulnerability. Now it's got to be locked down. The assessors can go look there, creates assessment risk and all that kind of great stuff.
Yeah, and that's really important because a lot of folks that take a system approach to this, like well, my ERP is part of the CUI process. Well, maybe not, right? If my ERP or my build of materials is just a list of things, it's an internet, it's an online catalog. If that's not actually part of the CUI that's specific to that document, that doesn't mean that the processes that you go build a product are necessarily part of that CUI, right? That's part of your build of materials, et cetera. And what we found is some customers just assume that if I have to go on the internet and look up parts that, well, it's part of my requirements to handle this, to fulfill my mission of the CUI, I got to go to this. So it extends out to their ERP systems and their online web browsing and their catalogs. And that's not at all the case. If it's not actually part of that CUI, if it's not actually part of the document or the end product that you are going to deliver, that's it's assembled product. The build of materials and the catalogs and that are not necessarily CUI. True?
Right. I mean, it's kind of possible it could be. You can get a letter that says that thing's going to be CUI, but a lot of times it's not. And you do have two conflicting stories here too inside the federal government. One is this idea of CUI, I have to protect it, I have to do all these things to it, but then you have a conflicting law out there. It's the Freedom of Information Act. Right? Like anything on these government contracts is supposed to be discoverable by the American taxpayer. And when you mark something as CUI, you're kind of removing it from that. It's that pre-redacting this. I'm stealing the American taxpayers' availability to see what was going on there with their spend. So this idea of calling too much CUI, absolutely can become a violation of the kind of public disclosures, protections that are out there today. So I mean, it's a very real risk. You can't just say, you know what, I'm just going to mark everything inside of my environment as CUI. That is also as bad as not marking anything CUI. So you have to do it right in order to be compliant.
So that brings us to a second point, and it's something I know you're passionate about. I share this passion. Is in the argument that the cost of compliance are too high, right? And so part of this is scope it correctly so you know what you actually have to handle. Don't over scope the environment because you can run afoul of two different laws. But B, there's cost associated to doing this. The argument, however, that I've made and you've made publicly is that if you signed for that DFARS contract, you've already attested that you've been doing this. It's a little bit, in my opinion, disingenuous to come back and say, wow, complying with CMMC is really hard. Because since 2015, you've been signing the contract clause that says, I'm going to adhere to 800-171 standards. So to come back now in 2025, 10 years later, and go, this is so hard, this is so expensive, I find that to be a really hollow argument. And of course, now you have Civil Fraud Act, et cetera, that can be brought into it. So what are your thoughts on that, Dewayne?
Yeah, I mean, you want to call BS on it, right? But I always try to be a little bit, put myself in another person's shoes, right? So everything we just described causes this sort of like anxiety that this is way too big. And then what does that anxiety do? It drives very slow decision making, very slow implementation because you've just made this thing way bigger than it's got to be. And if you can narrow it down to just think about, CMMC really is, it's a business process thing, it's a security thing, and it's a compliance thing. And if you can get your business processes under control, right, where you understand how you're flowing this stuff, where your boundaries are, where you're storing it, does that include your cabinets? You probably need to think about that. If you can narrow it down to just understanding that flow, you can move yourself out of this analysis paralysis model where you can actually move forward. So I don't think people are intentionally, not doing the thing. It's just that when you start putting it in this and you think everything has got to be pulled in under this compliance model, you're like, I'm just going to take my chances with a lawsuit. And I understand that point of view, right? So that's why I think the way we kind of approach this as a team and as a company, is really education first. Like, let's narrow this thing down to what you've really got to spend money on so that you can meet what you've been saying you've been doing for 10 years. Right.
Well, and I think, number one, I do think 800-171 gets a little bit maligned from the community who don't really understand that the vast majority of 800-171 is a best practices of cybersecurity. Like there's a little bit of the admin overhead that goes along with any of these frameworks, but the reality is for the majority of the controls, they are best practices that work really well against things like cybercrime and ransomware and data breaches, all the, not just nation state data breaches, but by far the most likely thing to happen to your environment, even as defense contractors, is cybercrime. Right. And so having at least looked at the framework to understand what the controls really are, I think most of it is senior executives, the people paying the bills, don't understand what the controls really are. And so they either A, have underinvested, or you've taken the word of somebody you maybe not have, or you don't have the requisite skills to understand what's truly in place versus what you've been briefed is in place, which is why so many executives are shocked when they get breached. Like they've been investing in tools and all this stuff. Like, what happened to all that money? What did we do wrong? And I think that in some respects, that's what I call sort of, this is the attestation piece, or the validation of attestation. I do think that the CMMC is a forcing function to say, not only have we been attesting to this by signing the contracts, but I think far too many people who don't really understand the mechanics of cybersecurity have been too willing to accept from their personnel that we're good, we're golden. We don't have a problem. We've invested all that money. Do you share that opinion, or what are your thoughts? Because you've led many a security agency, you've actually been a security architect for most of your career. What do you say as the folks that are responsible for doing the work? Back to it.
I'll tell you, the cost of these CISO's budgets are insane, right? So if you really want to reduce that cost, a lot of ways to do that is actually by properly implementing some of these controls we're talking about. So as an example, right, I've led multiple SOCs, and one of the major problems with trying to secure an environment or have insights into what's happening in the environment is a whole lot of misconfigured stuff, or unconfigured, or shelfware,
not fully
implemented. And if these CISOs really want to save money and be secure, they would start thinking about it from this point of view, right? If I configure my stuff properly and use some framework to follow by, and 800.171 is a good one. If you can follow that stuff, you're going to actually reduce your overall spend. You're going to reduce the amount of storage. You're going to reduce the amount of SOC analysts you got to have. You're going to reduce the amount of incidents you've got coming in. You're going to reduce the amount of logs that you've got something or someone having to sift through, right? So just putting proper security hygiene in on the front end, or taking the effort to do it as an initiative that is a cost-saving initiative, is well worth these CISOs and these executives thinking about, right? You can legitimately just reduce the amount of incidents your team's responding to 24/7 by properly implementing this stuff up front. And that's things that people don't think about. Like, you hear this, compliance is not security. Fair. But if you can follow a framework like 800.171 with your security practice, you will end up with a more secure environment with less noise and less expense overall, because the humans aren't having to spend their time really trying to chase things, looking for that needle in the haystack of what is really a security breach.
Yeah, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
That's correct.
Compliance frameworks aren't necessarily security, but they're a damn good framework to build security against. And if you don't have one of those and you don't adhere to one of those, how do you measure yourself? I think that's important. So just a slight deviation to this, because I think it's important. So I even start most of my CMMC talks with, this is the Chinese, new strike fighter. This is the Joint Strike Fighter. They look identical. This is the Chinese Humvee. This is the American Humvee. They look identical. The Chinese space shuttle looks exactly like ours. And it's because the taxpayer has been funding R&D for our adversaries for a long time through the industrial base. But I've been given cybersecurity talks now for 10 or 11 years. The top three initial access vectors have been the top three initial access vectors for over probably 15, 20 years. And so that being said, cybercrime, data breach, like data exfiltration, is now almost a ubiquitous component. It's actually a higher extortion tactic than ransomware. Like locking up your environment with a malicious binary actually is secondary now. Data theft is the number one. And so to our customers, yes, CMMC is derived around denying our nation state adversaries our R&D. But the reality is, if Ryuk or Lockbit or you name the group exfiltrates data, and you happen to be a manufacturer in the DIB, you still have government data that's gone outside of your environment, and now you still have to attest to its whereabouts, which in some respects is just as miserable as knowing that may have been a Chinese threat actor. It does not obviate the fact that you have data that belong to the DoD now exfiltrated out of your environment. And so I don't think we talk about that very much, but that is also a very real thing. We've had, we've all done incident response engagements for really large companies, and then after the breach, like, it's one thing to scope your environment, look for the CUI before you have a problem and while you're going through the attestation, but talk a little bit about like what happens after a breach and you've got data out there.
Yeah, and especially if you don't know and don't have good, insight into where your data was before, you don't have control over it. I mean, if you put yourself in those shoes, that mindset, like, I've just had a breach, I've been 2 weeks just trying to recover my environment, and then now here comes the feds knocking on the door. Okay, it's time to, you turned in your initial report to us, but now you got to tell us what you lost.
Mm-hmm.
What of our stuff's outside of there? And then you're just like right back to this, oh my God, I don't know. Okay, let me go back to my forensics team to help me do the cleanup. What all they touched, or said they touched these, X number of servers inside of my, 15 servers that were clearly, they touched. I can't tell you exactly what they took from them, but it could be on there. And now you're like, well, I got to take the data that's on this, and millions of files that could be spread across those. The government doesn't care about your data; they care about their data, right? So you're either going to tell them, "I lost all the stuff," or if you can go through and be like, "Hey, I've got some sort of idea of what data was where, these contracts were stored, on stuff that was on that server," then I can narrow down that report. Say, "Hey, I only lost this amount of stuff." Kind of again taking back that butt pucker moment that now you got to go tell the feds that I've lost everything and I can't even tell you exactly what I've got, to something that's more along the lines of, well, I did lose some stuff, but it was just this one contract over here, not all the other stuff. I can clearly show that the guy never touched where this contract was. And that's just having that data provenance, that ability to know where your data is and what's secure and what's the governance.
And there's two halves of that. There's really like that's a rationale for keeping it in a securely or in a secure assessed environment and maintaining it. But there's also a lot of data out there that preceded the assessment process, right? So that some of it is like finding it before that breach happens and then moving it where it's supposed to be. But you really have kind of three problem sets. You've got the post-breach, which is, crap, I need to make an attestation of what happened to the government's data. And if my current stuff is encrypted and I had a bunch of exfiltrated data, can I even tell you what went out? There's the scoping problem of where's my CUI? Do I have this? Like, how much do I have? Where is it at? Who's touching it? What people and what systems are touching it? So that's the problem of identifying it beforehand. And then you've got the kind of like, well, I know I have it and I know that it's out there, but now I need to sort of move it back into the assessed problem. And so you kind of have a three-pronged problem. And I think it's probably an appropriate time to sort of talk about how we solved it. And that effort that we put together to create the tool that is now a separate company.
Yeah. Well, another thing, what you were talking about there, I've never really had this kind of analogy before, but you go back to, sometimes in cyber crime defense, it's like, I don't necessarily have to be perfect or great at it. It's got to be better than my neighbor.
Right.
Let the bad guy go look at them.
Yeah.
Well, that can apply inside of your network too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if my network's here and I've got it all kind of stored and commingled kind of together and everything's there, they're just going to get in there. If I have a crown jewels locked away chunk inside of my network, they will just go everywhere else and not go after that because they can get plenty of stuff in that, but then you don't lose that kind of super high value. That crown jewels are protected. Here's my enclave, my vault, locked down in the middle of my environment, where basically the rest of your environment could be a honeypot, right? That's not my stuff that I'm having to report on. It's not quite as significant. So that kind of approach, that's basically what the government's telling us to do when they came up with CMMC. If you're a big organization, good luck meeting this everywhere, as it stands, the way 871 is written, right? It's probably going to bring your business to a crawl, very difficult, extremely expensive, or create me that little enclave, that secure spot inside of your network, put my data in it, and then get your business flows worked around processing inside of that instead of it being everywhere. And now a breach may not necessarily be a reportable event, because where the governance data wasn't breached as part of your larger breach, where you have lower security controls to try to raise that availability for the average user.
Yeah, I think the third party attestation piece of this is really, really important, or the third party validation of attestations. And so that we talk a little bit about is it the Civil Fraud Act and cyber fraud? What is it? It's the False Claims Act and the Cyber Fraud Initiative that goes under that, and the Department of Justice. Both of those kind of come into play, and the SEC has been going after publicly traded companies that have made these attestations. And so we're seeing a lot of the government finally saying, we've given you guidance, we've given you controls, we've given you a framework to attest to, you've signed on the dotted line. Now we're coming in to validate. And CMMC for a long time, we didn't think was going to see a lot of day. Got a lot of pushback from a lot of big corporations. But as we've seen time and time again in our incident response practice, even well-intentioned, even I'd go say patriotic companies who participated in the DIB believed they were adhering to all the standards, but actually weren't. And I used the example 3 Mile Island recently. You have a nuclear power plant that made every attestation. On paper, they were perfect. They met every compliance. They had training. They have incident response playbooks. They had ginormous volumes of incident response playbooks, and they had built a paperwork mountain to convince themselves they were good to go until the shit hit the fan, and then all of that actually just was a paperwork drill. None of it actually applied in real life, and no one had ever bothered to come in and do a no kidding objective view of that. And it's really kind of what the CMMC marketplace, or CMMC, I guess, as the framework of the DoD, is to do that. But let's talk a little bit about the cyber marketplace. I know that all three of us have come across people, individuals, and companies claiming to be, experts in consulting. Like, I've got NIST, lots and lots of NIST experience. I've done 853. I've done ATOs. I've done FedRAMP. I know all of this stuff. But they're not in the cyber marketplace. They haven't done their due diligence. They haven't actually looked at 801 specifically, much less done the investment of time and money to get into the cyber marketplace. Have you run into a lot of that in our customer base, or?
Yeah, and internationally, right? It happens all over the place where they'll bring in a new CMMC expert, right, to join the compliance team, and you just start having conversations about the various ways that they're doing things, and you quickly understand that the easy one is to start having conversations about the scope, right, and that'll show their hand almost every time, right? And they just don't. It's very, very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell on the marketing side who's good. Mm-hmm. The marketing outruns the capabilities in most cases. Mm-hmm. But when you actually start talking to them, you can fish it out really, really quickly.
My favorite is when you start talking to somebody and they'll say they're taking the enclave approach because they just got Microsoft GCC High.
That's right.
Just want to have just my email up there, and that's not an enclave. That's just a tenant. Right, the enclave is a whole entire environment that goes around that. It's the virtual desktop infrastructure and all that stuff that has to be built inside of that. And I've seen that a ton where people are like, "Oh yeah, buy an enclave," and it's just like that's not an enclave, right? That's just another email provider that you bought. Clearly, you did not understand this concept of what's processing CUI and bring that into scope. Another problem I think that happens there. It kind of goes back to. I know we've talked about this, kind of presentation before, but it's that old concept, that market of limits that's going on out there. Over time, and I can always make the argument this is why CMMC exists. Mm-hmm. They had to solve this problem, right? Like over time, kind of lost that technical ability. Everybody moved to the cloud and adopted things like Microsoft 365 and MSPs, managed service providers. No, I'm doing this work myself. Now I don't really have somebody that understands that nuanced difference. That there is more to it than just the GCC High environment or migrating my office tenant into the government cloud now saying I'm done. So really just having the ability to know that can be trusted, and that's what CMMC is doing. That attestation takes it from do you think that you're doing it correctly because you just simply didn't understand. Like, you weren't trying to be malicious. You just simply didn't know. Or like, I don't know how to perform heart surgery. So like, I can say, I think that guy did it right, but who knows, right? I'm not a person that knows that stuff. That marketplace, that third-party assessment removes that, because it doesn't matter how good the intentions were. The government's still losing data. They're putting warfighters in danger, and that they've got to stop that. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned you were. We're going to go in and we're going to stop that. And that's what CMMC is doing. It's addressing that underlying problem.
It really
very practical examples of that are like, why was code enforcement formed?
Right.
Because builders were building houses that were falling down. Right. Why was DHEC formed? Because restaurants were serving bad food. Right. So it's the same thing, right? They form these things because they realize that the problems still exist no matter what people are telling. Right. So that's what this all comes down to, is like, you can't trust that people, not bad intentions, they just aren't capable in a lot of ways to do these things. Right. We're fortunate enough. We've been doing this collectively, 50 years combined of the three of us. And we highly invest in our people to learn this, and our people are very experienced people, right? And that's why we can trust what we say.
Well,
right?
We have the benefit of being able to validate the technical skills of our personnel. What I find missing in a lot of corporate environments is that the folks that are doing the management and the hiring do not have the technical acumen to assess whether or not they're actually in a good place, both people and technology.
Correct.
Is something fully implemented? Do the people who are doing the work have the requisite skills to do it effectively? And they are taking leaps of faith. He sounds effective. He sounds good. He looked good on paper, on his resume. But how do I know that my Active Directory environment has got a tiered security model? How do I know my privileged access management is locked down to the appropriate? How do I know that I'm configured correctly? Well, I hired somebody to do that. Well, how do you know that they're good at what they do? And you have to get that third-party attestation, someone else that's coming in, and you sort of to validate that. That's why we do pen testing. It's why we do validation. And so all that is just a greater part. And I really think that the market lemons, and you brought this up, Andy, is that before CMMC, the cybersecurity marketplace has fallen into an asymmetric information marketplace, meaning cybersecurity professionals have all the information about what they can and cannot do. There's a level of IT expertise that's a bit esoteric. And that's got all the information and knowing what the capabilities are, what we can and what cannot do. The person procuring that probably doesn't have the eighth of the information that they need to make a valid determination. So now overlay that against really sensitive DoD data. So I still have this asymmetric problem in the marketplace that existed in cybersecurity, but now I've got to actually do compliance and security with the same lack of understanding. Do I really know what I've outsourced? Do I know what I've insourced? Do I really know what my security efficacy is? And that really is another part of why the marketplace is so important.
Another good, like, kind of easy example of that is, if I were to want to go install a toilet in your house, I need a license to do that. I got to go take a test. I got to do all these things in order to do that. But to go become the cybersecurity provider for your bank, all I've got to do is convince a person with a checkbook at that bank that I can do it. That there is no outside, like, I literally just got to write up, I'm going to do this and just convince them. And now I'm the cybersecurity provider and everything for that bank. Right? Clearly one of these is harder than the other, and yet we're only validating one half of that. So, I mean, these are all kind of the same problems layered into each other. And it goes back to that there is no license model for IT and for IT providers. And there's a ton of really good reasons why that exists. Right? Fourth Amendment clauses, we don't want the government snooping in all of our private data and all that stuff. But it's still a problem that leads to risk for our warfighters abroad, and we've got to solve that problem. That's what.
Yeah, and in this regard, it's not the company's data; it's the DoD's data.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So there is no Fourth Amendment when it comes to the government's data. This is DoD data, not yours. You're a good steward of it, right? You're supposed to be anyway.
And the government's not asking you to protect everything inside of your government.
That's right.
They're asking you to protect their information, right. and that's it. They don't care about the rest of your business, and they don't care if you taking their information makes your business cease to exist. They care about their information being protected, and that's it.
And I'm a big fan of NIST in a lot of ways, and the amount of thought and documentation and research that goes into this is huge. But I would say that of the frameworks I've seen, 800-171 is an excellent best practices guide. I mean, really, you could literally, I don't care if you're even in the DoD space or the DIB, literally the 80171 is kind of like a roadmap of how I would secure my company. I mean, it literally does cover everything that would be a best practice to having a secure environment, from even things just like run-of-the-mill cybercrime. Before we wrap it up, I thought we wanted to provide some good advice to our audience and folks that are struggling out there with CMMC compliance. But let's talk a little bit about pitfalls. There are a lot of we talked about individuals who are kind of snake oil salesmen. They don't have the requisite skills. They're not in the cyber AV marketplace. They're misrepresenting themselves. But I think we've also seen solution providers that have been making a lot of promises, but not being very forthright about where their solution begins and ends and what it covers and what it doesn't cover. So if you were going to provide, and without naming, any particular platform by name to call them out, but if you were going to, what are some of the things that people are suggesting are fully CMMC quote unquote compliant environments, but we're seeing not actually meeting the CMMC requirements? Like, what would you look for if you're trying to go out there and find solutions and expertise to help?
So the really big one that you see a lot of is, okay, I know that I read somewhere that I've got to have FedRAMP compliant tools for my COI assets. So then I go through, here's all the things that I'm using to process the government's data. And you go and you ask those providers, are you FedRAMP compliant? And they'll come back and they'll say, well, we're on the Azure Gov Cloud. You're like, okay, cool, you're on a FedRAMP cloud. That does not mean that company is FedRAMP compliant. That doesn't mean anything. Like, great, good for you. Show me your FedRAMP certification, because that is so much more than just what clouds you're hosted on. Or it's how you're actually handling my data when I hand it to you. And that's part of what I'm attesting to in my flow chain, my flow downs that come in place. That one I see all the time. And then, sometimes it's heartbreaking too when you tell them that these people bought this thing, they thought they were doing the right thing because that product is on, yes, it's on the correct cloud, but it still doesn't get them there. And then you have to tell them you got to rip all that, you got to rip it out, right? That's one of the big pitfalls that I've seen.
Are there platform or environment providers that are suggesting that if you move to my platform or you move to my capability that now you're good? I've seen a lot of folks saying all you need is our solution and you're CMMC compliant, but then we find out is they're only meeting like 60 or 80% of the actual controls, and there's a whole host of stuff that the customers still end up having to account for. Do you see, are there solutions and platforms out there? Like, what are the buyer beware kind of tips that you give folks?
Yeah, so you got to know those 110 controls, right? And you've got to be able to challenge that platform provider on where does their responsibility end and where does my responsibility pick up, right? And because even the platform providers that can get you almost there, there's a client-side responsibility that's got to be matrixed out, so you know what you got to do, right? These platforms, they're not going to cover your physical security. These platforms, they're not going to cover some of the things that are that's got to go in your policy packs, your access control policies. How do you present media out to the public? There's not a platform for that, right? It's just knowing where they end is the biggest problem, right? Where do you end so that I can pick up the rest of this?
Yep. I think it's also a big misconception is that because I got one of these providers, that solves my assessment problem. The reality is you need to ask as a person looking to procure help in this, do you help me with my documentation? Because the documentation got to be mapped to the controls, got to be mapped to the CUI, got to be mapped to the people, right? So, all of the controls have to be mapped and articulated, and oh, by the way, have to be validated by demonstrable evidence. Like, I can't just write it down and say it. I got to actually prove I'm doing it. And you can't just assume your platform or your partner provider is going to do any of that for you. So you need to ask, do you include documentation in this? Do you help me with the assessment piece? Like, how do I know if I'm answering these controls correctly? Do I meet the archival evidence requirements? How would I demonstrate to an assessor that I'm doing this? What part does my third-party provider get or do that I'm inheriting? And can I prove that? How do I prove that? I think a lot of that stuff is completely glossed over. I've seen some and you and I, we've come in behind quote unquote providers where they're on their third level, try, and they're looking for someone that's going to help them because they didn't understand all of the requirements of the 110. Remember, it's policy, process, procedure, archival evidence. All of that has to go into demonstrating that you're doing it correctly. Any final advice from either one of you to prospects or people who are trying to solve this problem for themselves?
Well, one other thing that you were just touching on it, this concept of assessment representation, right? If you're the provider that I'm going with, are you there in the room with me when I'm going through the assessment? What level of support are you going to give me there? Because as soon as you bought that from them and you kind of outsource that capability, you have to be able to speak to how that's solving every one of those objectives, right? Not just the controls, but every individual underlying objective. You got to understand how that's protecting that piece of data that you're the custodian for the government. So if they're not there willing to help you go through and answer those questions, they may be doing it right. And you're still going to fail your assessment because you're going to say the wrong thing to the assessor. Mm-hmm. You're not going to represent it correctly. You're simply not going to understand that thing. So that is one of the really big components that I would expect personally. If I was out there shopping in my customer's shoes, if you're the one helping me do this, and it may be, you got to bring a team of 15 of these people in here because you're sharing it across every one of them. I want every one of them, the expert there with me, at least calling in to answer those questions, not just giving me, here's a shared responsibility matrix and a good luck tap on the back, as you go in there. You're going to fail, right? Like, you're not going to get through that unless you just happen to have a guy with a PhD that can read that thing and decipher it. And if you have that, you probably weren't buying anything anyways.
And know what evidence maps to that objective,
exactly.
to that practice, right? I think that's a big piece that folks that don't understand.
That's these closed platform problems, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's very, very hard to find that artifact that proves what you're doing. So it may be doing it, but if you can't prove it in that interview, you got a problem. That's why you got to have somebody that can represent that properly on your platform side that you've purchased from.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why they put in the FedRAMP reciprocity, right? If it's a FedRAMP product and you're meeting the kind of configuration controls that came out of that SRM, now we know we can trust that. That's why reciprocity is so big. They've been through a much more egregious, an intrusive assessment than you have to prove that. So now you can trust that. And now, with the final rule that came out, that there's this idea of the ESPs and, them being CMMC certified. But if they're not, they've got to be there. That assessment skill goes right and brings them in, right? If that's a security protection asset, the controls that apply to them still have to be assessed.
Well, they may have reciprocity, but if you, as the company seeking certification, can't articulate how that control maps to that practice, how it meets that practice, meaning they may be doing it, and they may have reciprocity, but you still have to articulate how that maps to what you're doing, right? If you can't, that's still an inarticulate piece that's going to be missing from your assessment.
Keep in mind, when you're doing your assessment, right, the assessment methodology is I've got 3 methods. I've got to do 2 of them. So I can examine a document. I can read right there where you've written the correct answer down. You bought the correct product and you put it down. That's only one of the 3. I've got to test or I've got to interview that thing as well. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be able to demonstrate that you understand how that is. So exactly what you're saying. You've got to tell me as well in an interview, or you've got to go and show it in action to actually hit the 2 different proofs of points that you require there. So just because they're doing it will never be sufficient.
Yep.
You have to understand it.
Yeah, which is really good. I think that brings us up to sort of the wrap-up point here, is that depending on what statistic you're reading from the Cyber AB, I've read between 54 and 80% of customers seeking or companies seeking certification fail in this initial scoping call. Mm-hmm. They don't even make it past the initial scoping call. Sure. That means that there's been a whole lot of time, pain, and energy wasted because they didn't know what they didn't know until they got to that call. And that's a really expensive mistake to make. Now, if they have an appropriate, assessing body who understands, they're not gonna let them get past that initial call, right? Because everything else after that would be a waste of time anyway. And they send them back to the drawing board. But it's an incredibly expensive endeavor if you do it wrong. It doesn't have to be expensive if you do it right. But if you go in there with, I think I know what I know and I think I'm good, that is not a great place to be if you're investing tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to get compliant.
Well, think about it from the C3PO, that assessing body's perspective too. There's a very like real dynamic on their side. No C3PAO wants to be the C3PAO that gets a reputation of being just super hard and fails everybody, right? Like you go back to your FedRAMP 3PAOs, they track all those. There's the Ameritol FedRAMP Accelerate that shows all the assessments, and they just never end. They don't actually ever fail them. You don't want to be the assessor that's failing people. You'll get a reputation about buy your services from you again. So how do you try to do that? Well, you just don't even let them into the assessment, right? You got to stop it at the up front. Luckily, right now, it's typically blatantly obvious that this person just doesn't do anything. If they can at least kind of scope it and talk about it correctly, there's a good chance that they're going to be there. So that's kind of what they're using. But again, they don't want to fail people. So the assessment team wants you to pass as they're going through this. But of course, they have to be able to defend why they said you passed.
Sure, they have to have integrity. You want an honest assessment as well, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this.
Yeah, but then another kind of just, odd dynamic is what happens the first time that an assessor fails a company, and then that company can go, I did do this right, didn't get through the appeals process, but then I go and I ask 10 other assessors, and they all say that, yes, that would be a fine implementation of that thing. Well, now that assessor that failed me incorrectly because of whatever reason, they just caused real damages. Like I may have lost a contract, couldn't bid on something. I just suffered damages because this assessor is just trying to show how smart they were, right? Do you have a case against them? I mean, I would think you probably do. I'm no lawyer, but it feels like you do. So there is this kind of fine line that the C3POs also have to walk down, which is I have to do a good enough assessment. I can't get too crazy in the weeds. I got to accept the correct answer, but I also don't want to be that guy that's failing all the companies out there. Because you would never get any more work. You'll go right out of the market.
Yeah, I think most folks we deal with have integrity. It's not over. They're following the letter of the law, and they're looking for honest implementation, and not willing to accept misrepresentation. But they're not going to be overly arbitrary. They're not looking to fail people just to say I'm tough. Right. I think that. So I do think some practical advice that I would give is, if you're seeking an RPO to help you to make sure that you're ready to pass, you should be able to ask that RPO, how many companies have you successfully brought through assessment and what scores? No one can give you a guarantee. Guarantees are illegal and against the code of ethics. But you should ask them, how many companies have you successfully brought through assessment and what are the scores? That should not be a problem for a valid RPO to say, we, Cape Endeavors, 23 companies and counting successfully through with 110. But you should also ask your assessor, if you're seeking a third-party assessing organization, how many companies have you done? How many joint surveillance assessments have you done with a DIBCAC? Like how many customers have you actually done this for? And what you can just sort of get an idea for what their experiences are. There's not a lot. We've got a lot of people needing assessment. There's very few companies doing those assessments. There's more RPOs, but still not enough to service everyone. But even in that sphere of limited data, there's enough data to show trending. Right, you can discern by asking some questions about past performance, determining how well someone's going to do for you as a company seeking certification.
Yeah, and we're certainly getting better. Right back, I remember the first time I went to a DIBCAC joint surveillance. That was when the 80% number was being floated around. 80% of companies don't get through the assessment or the readiness phase at the beginning, and we're down into the mid 50s now. It's still more than 1 out of every 2 doesn't get their assessment. It's better. We're progressing. So this is the CMMC working, right? The information is getting out there. We're getting better at it over time, but it's still flip a coin if you're actually ready or not. And the amount of money that you're having to spend to protect some of these things, it's not worth that. It's worth that little bit extra investment to get a hold of somebody that actually who's been through it, right? Experience is everything here. Even if somebody that's been through a failed one, at least they've seen it. They've been asked the question, as opposed to somebody that just maybe got the RP designation but doesn't have any experience on and really will talk to stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's enough evidence out there now to suggest who is credible and who's less credible in the space for both the RPOs and the third-party assessing organizations. Yeah. Okay, we're going to wrap it up here shortly. Final thoughts for the audience, final advice that you would give, Dewayne?
All of this is a team sport. Find somebody that can help you.
Mm-hmm. Who's willing to play on the team.
That's right.
Yeah. It's not a gotcha game.
That's right.
Final words from you, Andy?
From my perspective, I'm sitting here rocking the Terry shirt. There's know where your CUI is. It is possible to find it, and it's possible to find it with high accuracy. Don't make decisions based off bad data. And that's what happens when you go in there just in this ephemeral, my CUI is everywhere. You actually get actual data, interview your people, understand your process flows, use tooling that can actually go and find it with a high delivery or a high rate of accuracy, so that you can trust these results. Because again, just because I can give you a scan report doesn't mean that scan report was accurate. Doesn't mean you asked the right question to the tools, or the tools were actually capable of delivering the answer you think you're getting from it. So that validation is key, and being able to have somebody on staff that understands that. Is the difference in you passing a CMMC assessment in 90 days and 2 years from now, I've just wasted a whole bunch of money, not got contracts, right? And just still sitting there being like, this is too hard, just screaming into the wilderness about, why this shouldn't work, instead of just having done what you were saying you've been doing since 2015 with your attestations.
Yeah, I think the last thing I would offer, because we've seen this both in post-breach as well as scoping, relying on manual effort to try to find CUI is a fool's errand. It's a quixotic mission.
Too much data.
It's too much data. I was even like, I just looked at my home office, between my desktop, my laptop, and like a server. There's no way in hell I can go through and click through all the folders and files that are on there and try to manually review just on that limited piece of hardware, much less if this was actually a corporate environment. And so manually doing this process is not going to help you. Relying on a data loss prevention tool or an e-discovery tool, do yourself a favor and at least make sure that you have a representation of sample that passes muster. If you do a scan of 20 million files and it comes back and tells you that 400,000 of them are CUI, but it's just because they got recruit and biscuit and other things in it because the regex capability stinks, or they can only look at OCR documents. Again, someone manually has to go back and validate that. And that's an inordinate amount, and the time to do that, even if you spent 20 seconds per document and you're talking about tens of thousands or 100,000 of documents, you're talking about tens of years of FTE to try to do that correctly. So I implore people to ensure that you find the right tool for the right task. You're not going to be able to solve it with human capacity. And if you pick the wrong tool, you'll get bad data and you'll make bad decisions on it. So I would make sure that whatever tool you pick can pass a veracity and accuracy test that you would want to give it.
And that's not a silver bullet. It's part of the overall
process.
Right?
Absolutely.
You've got to do it all. And if somebody comes selling you a silver bullet, this does everything,
they're lying.
Just go away, right? Yep. Just turn around, walk away.
There is no easy button here. If there were, we would all solved it a long time ago.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to Cape Endeavors Incorporated's Bourbon and Bytes. We welcome you to our next episode, and we look forward to any feedback that you have. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and provide us some feedback and some comments and maybe even suggestions of what you'd like to see next.